Now, faith is the assurance, the hypostasis, of things hoped for, the conviction, the elenchos, of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Back on August 10th, 1997, Hebrews 11 rocked my world. My wife and I had just finished grad school, moved to Minnesota, and begun attending Bethlehem. And that Sunday, John Piper preached on Hebrews 11, 29 through 38. He pointed out that by faith, God rescues some of his people from the sword, verse 34, and 3 verses later, by that exact same genuine God-approved saving faith, God enables others of his people to persevere through being put to death by the sword, verse 37. That juxtaposition rocked my world because it convinced me that God willingly sacrifices the temporary earthly peace and prosperity and enjoyment of his people in order to give them something better, something eternal, himself. To quote that sermon, when you can have it all, faith says that God is better. And when you lose it all, faith says God is better. Now, verses 20 through 38 are not today's text. Our text is earlier in the chapter, verses 4 through 7. But it is relevant. So, as we read today's text, keep asking, how do the lives of Abel, Enoch, and Noah illustrate the principle that underlies being delivered up or dying to the sword, both of them by faith? To help us understand and apply the text, we're going to work our way through 3 questions. The first question is one of the larger context. Why does the author bring up these examples, Abel, Enoch, and Noah? What's he using the examples to explain or to prove? Second question, what does it mean that Abel, Enoch, and Noah did the things they did by faith? Abel sacrificed by faith, Enoch was taken up by faith, Noah built an ark by faith. What does the by faith mean? Final question, what did they get as a result of doing what they did by faith? What was the result of it? So our 3 questions are, what's the point of these examples? What's the author doing with them? What does it mean that they did things by faith? And what was the result? What did they get as a result of this? So, first question, why does the author bring up these examples? Hebrews chapter 11 is a series of examples. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, the people at the Red Sea crossing, the people at the fall of Jericho, Rahab, and many more. What is the author doing with these examples? What should we notice and conclude from them? The answer to this lies outside of today's verses, chapter 11, verses 4 through 7. Let's look then to the end of the preceding chapter, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 35 through 39. I quote, Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and endure their souls. The author is urging his readers to endure in doing the will of God. And the way to do this is to live by faith, banking our hope on the promised reward, the coming one, who we now know is Jesus himself, verse 37. The alternative is to throw away our confidence, verse 35, and shrink back, verses 38 and 39. So, endure by faith or throw away our confidence and shrink back. Those are the options. The stakes are high. Enduring by faith leads to a great reward, verse 35. Receiving what was promised, verse 36, from the coming one, verse 37. Being classified as righteous, which means having God take pleasure in us, verse 38. And preserving our souls, verse 39. The alternative, throwing away our confidence, not only forfeits those rewards, but it also leads to being destroyed, verse 39. The stakes are high, but the author ends the chapter by expressing confidence that his readers are of the people who have faith and preserve their souls. This leads then into chapter 11 of examples of people who have faith and preserve their souls. So, what's the author doing with the examples of Hebrew chapter 11? Answer. He's doing it in order to illustrate what it looks like to endure, living by faith, banking our hopes on the coming reward, and then to motivate us by illustrating the outcome of such a life. He wants us to endure. That's what those examples are for. To check that answer, let's look at the context after the examples of chapter 11. So go to chapter 12. Chapter 12 begins, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. We are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. In context, the witnesses are all the examples of chapter 11. And notice the conjunction, therefore. The author brings up all the examples of chapter 11 in order to motivate us to lay aside every weight and sin in order to run with endurance the race set before us. Motivating us to endure is exactly the purpose that we concluded from the end of chapter 10. It is also the purpose of his final example. Hebrews 12 continues in verse 2, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. He points us to Jesus, who endured by looking to the future reward, the joy set before him, to motivate us to endure instead of growing weary or faint-hearted. So this is at least the third time that he's explained what these examples should do in our lives. Motivate us to live by faith, to endure seeking the reward. So, in answer to our first question, look to the examples of Abel, Enoch, and Noah living by faith in order to be motivated to do the same ourselves. Hebrews 11 was not written to define what faith is. It was written to motivate us to live by faith. by showing us biblical examples of what living by faith looks like and showing us the outcome of such a life. In the words of Hebrews 11:2, the examples of chapter 11 illustrate the people of old receiving their commendation by faith. So, what does it mean to live by faith? That's our big second question. What does it mean that Abel, Enoch, and Noah did the things they did by faith? To answer this, let's actually bump ahead and start with Enoch in verse 5. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. The statement that he was not found is a quotation of Genesis 5:24, which says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Genesis 5:24 occurs in a historical record that lists person after person beginning with Adam. Verse 4, the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Person after person follows with the same pattern. Each record ends with, and he died. Seth died, Enosh died, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech all died. But in the middle of this list, Enoch did not die. Instead, quote, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Enoch went straight from living in the body on earth to being with God in heaven without dying in between, just like Elijah, because God took him. Hebrews tells us that this happened by faith. Being taken up is not even something Enoch did. It is something that God did to him. Furthermore, the text in Genesis doesn't even mention faith. So how is Enoch an example of living by faith? The biblical evidence is the last clause of verse 5 in Hebrews 11. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Where does this come in Genesis? Genesis 5:24 says that Enoch walked with God. That means he walked in God's ways, following God, in fellowship with God. Hence, the Septuagint translates walked with God as pleased God, euristeo, which is the word that Hebrews 11:5 uses. Why, then, does it go to the Septuagint to mention Enoch's pleasing God? Answer, because pleasing God proves from the Genesis text that Enoch was a man of faith. So how does pleasing God prove that? The logic of the next verse explains how pleasing God is proof of faith. Hebrews 11:6 says, and without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Here's the logic of the connection to verse 5. Verse 6 says that one cannot please God without faith, but verse 5 says that Enoch pleased God. Therefore, Enoch had faith. Enoch's pleasing God, his walking with God, proves that Enoch lived by faith. This raises the question, why is it impossible to please God without faith? Verse 6 explains, pleasing God necessitates drawing near to him, and no one draws near to God unless they think God exists and rewards those who seek him. Verse 6 then not only explains how we can know from Genesis 5:24 that Enoch lived by faith, but it also helps us to understand what it means to do so. Living by faith is drawing near to God, seeking him out of desire for the reward of God's presence. Now, I've added in there that it says he's seeking the reward of God's presence. That's not explicit in Hebrews 11:6. It just says they draw near to God seeking a reward. Why do I draw that conclusion? Because if someone is pleasing God by drawing near to him, what they must be drawing near to him is God himself. If somebody comes up to me and says, hey, John, I want to hang out with you, And the reason they want to hang out with me is not because they enjoy hanging out with me, but because they want to, slip their hand in my pocket and steal my wallet or whatever, something they can get from me. That's not going to please me. Okay? Therefore, from that I conclude that if they are drawing near to God and that pleases God, they are drawing near to God for God himself. God is the reward that they are ultimately seeking from drawing near to God. Notice the Christian hedonism. What does it mean that Enoch was taken up by faith? It means that he lived drawing near to God out of desire for a reward that only God can give, God himself. And he drew so near to God that God brought it to completion by taking Enoch straight up into his presence. That's what it means that Enoch lived by faith. What about Abel? Verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. Both Abel and Cain offered sacrifices to God. According to Hebrews 11:4, Abel's sacrifice was more acceptable. The word here is pleona, which is the comparative form of polis, many, great, or much. So the NIV, the NASB, and the CSB all translate it better. Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain. Why was Abel's sacrifice better? Well, let's look at the original reference, which is Genesis 4, verses 3 through 5. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Why was Abel's better? Why did God have regard for Abel and his offering? Based on the Genesis text, we can notice that Abel's was an animal sacrifice, so some have suggested that it was better because it points to the need for shed blood for forgiveness and thus ultimately for the need for Christ, the Lamb of God whose blood takes away the sin of the world. That's true, but Cain was a farmer, and so it seems less likely to me that God said, okay, Cain, what I really want you to do is grow your crops, trade them to Abel for some lambs, and then sacrifice some of the lambs. If he's going to have to do that, why not just start out with the lambs? Okay, we're speculating here. But here's the key difference, I think. Notice also that Cain simply offered some of his produce, whereas Abel offered the first and the best, the firstborn and their fat portions. That even itself is not really the crux of the matter, though. According to Hebrews 11:4, the fundamental issue was not the offering itself, produce versus lamb, firstborn versus later born, but rather what motivated and directed the offering. Abel's offering was better because it was offered by faith, whereas Cain's was not by faith. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice, a better sacrifice than Cain, because it was marked by faith. Well, what does it mean that Abel's sacrifice was by faith? The Bible does not state this directly, but Genesis 4:4 does say that the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. And Hebrews 11:4 notes that God accepted Abel's offering and states that God thereby commended Abel as righteous. Since God was pleased with Abel's offering, following the logic of Hebrews 11:6 that we just used to analyze Enoch, we can also say that because Abel pleased God through his sacrifice, Abel did so by faith, because without faith it is impossible to please God. Which means that Abel's intent in sacrificing, in the words of Hebrews 11:6, was to draw near to God, believing that the reward of doing so, God himself, was better than what he gave up. He gave up the best he had, the firstborn of his flock, including their fat portions, believing that the reward of the nearness of God was better. Imagine the scene. Okay? This is the very beginning of human history. Abel got his very first lambs. He must have been so excited. Yes, more sheep. And they can grow up and have more sheep, and then they can have more sheep. But you know what? I want God more. Being near to God would be better than sheep as far as the eye can see. I'll give these to God. I mean, it's not like he needs them, but I want God's presence so much. Mom and Dad told me stories of what it was like to walk with God before the fall. I want that so much more than any number of sheep. So I'll give God these sheep, my very first sheep, telling him that. And so Abel gave gladly. He gladly, eagerly gave to God the best he had, because for him, the nearness of God was better. That's what it means that Abel offered a sacrifice by faith. Faith about the value of the nearness of God. What about Noah? Verse 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. In Genesis 6, God warned Noah that he would destroy the earth with a flood and commanded him to build a ship to save his family as well as pairs of each type of animal. Noah couldn't see the flood. It hadn't happened yet. Furthermore, a flood like that was totally unprecedented. No one had ever experienced a flood anything like that. And the project was huge. No going to the hardware store to pick up huge planks, no modern saws or forklifts or cranes, and no experience building anything like this. But Noah trusted what God said and devoted years of his life to building a huge boat and then stocking it with food. He probably looked like a fool, but he did it anyway, year after year. Now, at this point, you might be saying, whoa there. The text only mentions Noah caring about earthly things, saving his family from the flood, not about drawing near to God, unlike Abel and Enoch. Okay. True, that's all that's mentioned in this one verse that Noah gets in the book of Hebrews chapter 11. But if we go back to Genesis 6, we see that giving up years of labor to obey God, trusting God that something no one had ever seen was going to happen, we see that building the boat was simply the most visible example of a life of faith. Genesis 6 verse 8 says, Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. Based on the logic of Hebrews 11:5 and 6 that we just discussed, pleasing Yahweh, finding favor in his eyes, proves that Noah lived by faith. He lived a lifestyle of drawing near to God, seeking God for the reward of his presence. And then the next verse, Genesis 6:9 says, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. That phrase, Noah walked with God, is the same wording as was used for Enoch in Genesis 5:24. So we have biblical evidence of two types that Noah lived by faith, just like Enoch did. So, in answer to our question, what does it mean that Abel, Enoch, and Noah did these things by faith? Abel gave to God the first and best he had out of a desire to draw near to God, believing that God's presence was better than anything he would have to give up. And Enoch and Noah walked with God, meaning that they lived their lives drawing near to God, seeking the reward of God's presence. And we aren't told the specifics of what that looked like for Enoch, but for Noah, it included spending years building and stocking a huge boat that God told him to build to save his family from a threat he could not see. Now, for our final question, what did they get as a result of living by faith? What did they get by living their lives trying to draw near to God out of a desire for God, out of believing that God is better than anything else? If I could just be with God, that would be better than anything. What did they get from that? Well, let's start with Enoch. What reward was Enoch seeking from God? What did he get? Well, while on earth, Enoch got God's presence. He walked with him. And then God took him. The end. Enoch lost the rest of his earthly life. No more enjoying the pleasures of earth. And in place of that, he got the presence of God. Was that a good trade? So imagine for yourself, would you actually want this right now? What would you lose if God took you right now just like Enoch? Poof! One person in this congregation just disappeared because God took him, and that was you. No more hanging out with your friends and family on earth, talking, eating together, playing soccer, playing football. And in fact, if you're married, no more being married to your spouse. There's no marriage in heaven. And some of you are engaged. Well, you'd never get that wedding and honeymoon and marriage. Instead, you'd get God. And you would get the wedding supper of the Lamb, where you are a member of the bride of Christ. So imagine that trade. You lose everything you've got here, and you get God instead. Does that feel like, I know I should want that, but not yet? Can I wait until after I get married, or until I get to enjoy this next thing, or maybe wait till I'm 80 and then take me? The fact that God took him proves that Enoch did not want to wait. He wasn't hoping to store up and enjoy more treasures on earth while still stocking up treasure in heaven. All of Enoch's treasure was in heaven. So when he lost everything on earth but got God's presence instead, he thought, best trade ever. As Paul put it, to die is gain. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. That's Paul's faith, the same as Enoch's. What about Abel? Abel gave up the firstborn of his flock, but he thereby drew near to God. And then, unplanned by Abel, his seeking God resulted in him losing everything on earth and getting God instead much sooner than he expected. This was like Enoch, but for Enoch it happened by God taking him, whereas for Abel it was by his brother Cain murdering him, seemingly out of jealousy. So was it worth it for Abel? Our text says that through his faith, Abel is still speaking even though he died. To whom is he speaking? And what is he saying? Well, it doesn't state that explicitly in that verse, but since the chapter is using these examples to motivate us to live by faith, Abel is speaking to us, motivating us to live by faith. And given that verse 6 says that faith necessarily includes drawing near to God out of desire for the reward of God's presence, Abel is telling us right now, draw near to God whatever it costs. Abel is saying, it cost my life, but it was worth it. What about Noah? Noah lived his life walking with God like Enoch, which in his case included spending years of his life working on building his huge ark project. What did he get? Well, the immediately visible reward is that he saved his family from the flood. This visible reward of rescue from God's judgment of the flood was a picture of the greater rescue that Noah received through God counting him as righteous by his faith, in contrast with the rest of the people not on the ark who were thereby condemned. Verse 7, by this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. In summary, here are the answers to our three questions. Question 1, what's the purpose for the examples in Hebrews 11? Answer, they were written to motivate us to live by faith, by showing us biblical examples of what living by faith looks like and showing us the outcome of such a life. Question 2, what does it mean that Abel, Enoch, and Noah did the things they did by faith? Answer, for Abel, living by faith included giving the best he had to God in an effort to draw near to God because he desired the reward of God's presence more than he desired his earthly treasure. And by the fact that he's still speaking, it also tells us that living by faith means that he thought that trade was worth it. Even getting killed by his brother sometime thereafter and losing the rest of his life, Good trade. For Enoch and Noah, living by faith was a lifestyle of walking with God, meaning they lived their lives drawing near to God, seeking the reward of God's presence. And question 3, what did they get as a result of doing what they did by faith? Answer, in all 3 cases, walking by faith costs them. For Abel, it cost him the best he had, and then it cost him his life. For Enoch, it also cost him the rest of his earthly life. And for Noah, it cost him years of his life working on a project that looked crazy. But in return, they drew near to God. They got God himself. They lost treasure on earth, time and possessions, but they gained treasure in heaven instead, God himself. And the very essence of living by faith is seeing that trade as a huge win. By now, the answer to my introductory question should be obvious. In Hebrews 11:34 and 37, God's people can escape the sword by faith, or they can die to the sword by faith, because living by faith is drawing near to God, convinced that the reward of his presence is better than anything they have to give up to get God. Noah and his family survived the flood by faith, escaping the sword by faith. Abel and Enoch lost their earthly lives by faith, dying to the sword by faith. For all 3 of them, the reward of God's presence was worth whatever it cost them, which is why it was by faith. Living by faith is costly. If it does not cost you earthly treasure of one type or another in order to gain treasure in heaven, how can it be by faith? No man can serve 2 masters. Either he will love the one and hate the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. We cannot serve both God and money. We've got to give up one treasure to get the other. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, every example in Hebrews 11, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. He is our great reward. Amen.